Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 63 for the 22 of Shevat in a leap year. And we are continuing in chapter 23. It's a pretty long chapter. And we're getting into, we've been talking about Torah and mitzvahs and what happens when we perform mitzvahs, what happens when we study Torah, internal way in terms of our souls and what's happening there in our connection with God in this way. And we talked about, just to give a little bit of a recap again, how when we do mitzvahs, what's happening is that we make our bodies and the external garment of our godly soul into a vehicle, a chariot basically for God's will. And yesterday we talked about how this is in contrast to studying Torah, and how studying Torah or thinking about Torah, whether it's just alone in our thoughts or whether it's out loud when we speak Torah and out loud and words of Torah, this actually gives us the ability not just to be a vehicle for God's will, but actually to have these internal garments of thought and speech to become unified and one with God's will, with the supernal will of God. Today, we're going to continue along these lines, and we're going to really, really get into the uniqueness of Torah study and how this is something which, as human beings, it's actually this amazing gift that we'll learn that is something that is unique to us, and that it's something that is only accessible to us by virtue of the fact that we are human. And it's something that even the angels and even the souls in the higher realms cannot achieve. This particular unity that we can achieve through Torah study and through thinking about Torah and speaking Torah. And it's even greater even than prayer. So there's something about Torah and about learning Torah, about thinking about Torah, using our minds, using our thoughts, and using our speech to think about these things that really is quite incredible. So let's get into it, and I'll get straight into the text and maybe try to give a little recap at the end. Okay, so since the supernal will, which is unified with the infinite, blessed be He, meaning with God, with utmost unity, since this unity is totally revealed and not at all concealed in the godly soul and in its garments, its internal garments, which are, again, thought and speech, at the time that a person is involved in Torah study, thus also his nefesh, also his soul and his garments are also totally unified with God at that time, with utmost unity. Just like the unity of God's thought and speech within himself, as explained above. So that was like a pretty long sentence. Let me try to just break that down a little bit. We'll give a little summary, and we'll see here also why that there really is a buildup in Tanya. And there's, hopefully you've been following along the podcast. If not, like I always say, please go back and try to start at the beginning. And even though each episode is a standalone episode in its own way, it really does help to have the full context, because we see here, this is a really good example of how the Alter Rebbe really builds on all the knowledge, everything that we've learned so far. So with that being said, so we know that we've learned so far that God is totally unified with his thought and his speech. So, we talked about how, God's thought and speech is different than our thought and speech, because even though those are kind of united with us, there's still a little bit of a separation. For God, it's totally united. Him, his thought and his speech are all totally, totally, totally united. And we also learned about how our thoughts and our speech are our internal garments. And we also learned about how thus when we use our thought and speech, our internal garments, to learn and be involved in Torah study, which is God's wisdom and God's thoughts, what happens is we create this unity with God's thoughts and God's speech, which are totally unified with God himself, right? So we're actually creating this really big unity between us and God. And the truth is, now I'll go back into the text. The truth is that this unity actually always exists. Everything is united with God. There's nothing that's not united with God. The only thing is that sometimes it appears that there's something called hester panim. There's a concealment. It appears as if things are not unified with God. But when a person is involved in Torah study, whether it's in their thought or their speech, this unity actually becomes revealed. And this unity is so strong, the Alter Rebbe says, that it's actually even stronger than the united light that's in the supernal worlds. So how is this? When we think about the supernal worlds, we think about earth, down here, we're kind of like in this lowly earth. And then there's like heaven or, the afterlife or the higher spiritual realms. We think of those as being like a more revealed kind of space, right? But what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that the unity that happens when a person is involved in Torah study is actually a greater unity than that which is experienced in the higher realms. So how could this be? This is because what we are learning when we're learning Torah is it's actually the will of God himself. And we know that all of the supernal worlds, where do they get their vitality from and their life force from? It comes from the Torah, which is what is the Torah again? The Torah is the will and wisdom of God. As it says, and here the Alter Rebbe brings a citation from Tehillim 104, verse 24, where it says, "Kulam bechokma asita," you made them all with your wisdom. So this is alluding to the fact the Alter Rebbe is saying that Hashem created all the worlds with his wisdom. And what is the wisdom of God is Torah. So Torah is above all these worlds because Torah is the source of all these worlds. And Torah is God's will, which is also called Sovev Kol Almin. So it's also called the light which surrounds all the worlds. And what this means when we say it's the light that surrounds all the worlds, it means that it cannot be vested within all the worlds. It's higher than all the worlds, but rather it just gives life and vitality and illumination above in a way that's more like hovering, like an encompassing way, in a way of makif, it's called in Hebrew. And so when a person studies Torah, this actual will, which is not able to vest itself inside of all of these supernal worlds, actually does vest itself inside of the soul of the person that's learning it in a way that's actually revealed, because you're actually, thinking about these words of Torah in a very revealed way. And even though a person isn't aware of this while they're learning Torah, they're not like, oh my gosh, aware of this tremendous revelation that they're experiencing, because if they did, they wouldn't be able to handle it. And actually, this is why Hashem set it up like this. Hashem set it up that we're not aware of this tremendous revelation that we get when we learn Torah, because we wouldn't be able to handle it. And this is why the higher worlds that are more conscious of what's going on, they don't have this revelation, whereas we do. So it's sort of like because of our inferior intellect that we are granted this ability. And this is why the Alter Rebbe concludes here that this is how we can understand the greatness of being involved in Torah above any other mitzvah. So there's something about learning Torah that's greater than any other mitzvah, even tefillah, even prayer, which prayer, we know, as learned elsewhere, as it's taught elsewhere, is the idea of the unification of all of the supernal worlds. And then in brackets, the Alter Rebbe concludes as he says, this doesn't, and then, it is taught. How can we understand this teaching where it says that somebody who Torah is not their sole occupation needs to stop in the middle of Torah study in order to pray? So you could think to yourself, like, that doesn't make sense. If Torah is so high and it's such a great thing to learn Torah and it's even greater than prayer, why should a person have to interrupt their Torah study in order to pray? So first of all, if somebody's actual sole occupation is Torah study, they actually don't need to do that. But what the Alter Rebbe is teaching here is that if somebody's sole occupation is not Torah study, they are obligated to nevertheless interrupt their Torah study to pray. Why is this? The Alter Rebbe says, because they most likely would interrupt their Torah study anyways. So might as well interrupt their Torah study to for prayer. So that's the conclusion of this section. And there's a lot there. It's pretty dense. So just to recap it to the best of my ability. So what it's basically saying in more simple terms is it's basically saying that when we think about God's wisdom and when we think about God's will, his supernal will, and we think about Torah, we should not think of these things as separate things. They're actually all one and the same. All these things are one and the same. Torah, God's wisdom, and God's will are all totally unified. They're all the same thing. And what created all the worlds? We say that God created all the worlds through his wisdom. And so when we say that all the worlds were created through God's wisdom, what we're basically saying is that God created all the worlds through Torah. And so when we study Torah, it's not a simple thing. We think that, we're studying Torah. Oh, it's just kind of interesting. We want to know a little bit more about how we're supposed to live, or, this is something we're supposed to learn as Jews and whatever. But the Alter Rebbe is taking it and making us realize what a much greater thing is happening there. When we're studying Torah, this is the will and wisdom of God himself. And since the will and wisdom of God himself is united with him, that means when we use our brains, when we use our thoughts and our speech to unite with God's thoughts and God's speech and God's wisdom and God's will, what we're actually doing is we're at that moment in a state of revealed unity with him and with his will and with his wisdom. And so that's a really, really intense thing. And although we may not be conscious of it, and the Alter Rebbe says that this is intentional that we're not conscious of it, because if we were conscious of this unity that would be happening, we wouldn't be able to handle it at all. And this is why he granted it to us and not to the angels. But we should know, at least on this intellectual level, that this is what's happening. That when we study Torah, whether it's with our thoughts and thinking about these things or with our speech, we are revealing a real unity of our thoughts and our speech and our souls themselves with the will and wisdom of God himself. And this is a type of unity that is actually not revealed anywhere else in any other manner, not even in the higher worlds. So, something to think about, something to ponder. And just by virtue, I'll conclude with this, what we're doing right now, studying Torah, this is exactly it. So by virtue of listening to this podcast, by virtue of thinking about the ideas that we are talking about in this podcast, by virtue of sharing these ideas in this podcast with your friends or whatever, you are actually experiencing this revealed unity that we've been talking about. So I'll leave you guys with that thought, something to kind of, wrap your minds around and think about. And we'll continue tomorrow. I'll speak to you. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.